The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty mountain trail as Sarah Mitchell stumbled forward, her swollen belly making each step a monumental effort. 8 months pregnant and completely alone in the wilderness of Colorado's Rocky Mountains, she clutched her backpack straps with trembling hands. Her water bottle had been empty for hours, and the baby inside her seemed to sense her distress, kicking frantically against her ribs. Sarah had never imagined her life would come to this moment. Just 6 months ago, she had been living comfortably in Denver with her husband Mark, planning for their first child's arrival. They had painted the nursery a soft yellow, assembled the crib together on a lazy Sunday afternoon, and dreamed about their future as a family. Mark had been so excited about becoming a father that he started reading parenting books before Sarah even started showing. But everything changed the night Sarah discovered the truth about her husband's double life. She had come home early from work, hoping to surprise Mark with his favorite takeout dinner, only to find him in their bedroom with another woman. The confrontation that followed revealed years of lies, secret affairs, and financial betrayals that left Sarah's world completely shattered. Mark had been draining their savings account to fund his gambling addiction, leaving them deep in debt. The house they thought they owned was about to be foreclosed on, and the comfortable life Sarah had built was nothing more than an illusion. The divorce proceedings had been brutal and swift. Mark's lawyer was more expensive and more ruthless than the legal aid attorney Sarah could barely afford. In the end, she lost almost everything. The house was sold to pay debts she never knew existed. Their joint accounts were frozen during lengthy court battles, and Sarah found herself alone, pregnant, and nearly homeless. Her parents had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, and her only sister lived overseas with her own family struggles. With nowhere else to turn, Sarah had accepted a job offer from a small environmental research company based in the remote mountains of Colorado. The position offered housing in a company cabin and decent pay, but it required her to live in isolation while conducting wildlife surveys. The job was supposed to be temporary, just until she could get back on her feet financially and figure out her next steps as a single mother. The cabin had been her sanctuary for the past few months. Nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pine trees and snow-capped peaks, it offered the peace and solitude Sarah desperately needed to heal from her emotional wounds. She spent her days documenting animal migration patterns, taking photographs of the local ecosystem, and slowly preparing for the baby's arrival. The company had assured her that medical care was available in the nearest town, just a 2-hour drive down the mountain road. But yesterday morning, everything had gone wrong. Sarah woke up to find her company truck wouldn't start, and her satellite phone was completely dead. The backup radio equipment had been damaged in a recent storm, and the landline to the cabin had been cut by falling tree branches weeks ago. She was completely cut off from the outside world with no way to call for help or reach medical assistance. The contractions had started gently during the night, barely noticeable at first. Sarah had convinced herself they were just the Braxton Hicks contractions her doctor had warned her about, but as the hours passed, they became stronger and more regular. By noon, she realized with growing panic that she was in early labor, still several weeks before her due date. With no vehicle and no communication, Sarah had made the desperate decision to walk to the main road, hoping to flag down a passing car or truck. The trail from her cabin to the highway was steep and treacherous, winding through dense forest and rocky terrain. Under normal circumstances, it was a challenging 3-hour hike for an experienced outdoors person. For a woman in active labor, it seemed nearly impossible, but Sarah had no choice. The alternative was giving birth alone in the cabin, with no medical supplies and no way to get help if something went wrong. So she packed a small bag with water, energy bars, and the few medical supplies she had on hand, and began the most difficult journey of her life. The first hour hadn't been too bad. The contractions were still manageable, and Sarah was able to maintain a steady pace on the familiar trail. She knew every twist and turn of the path, having walked it dozens of times during her months in the mountains. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles and wildflowers. But as the day wore on and the sun climbed higher, Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly. The contractions became more intense and frequent, sometimes forcing her to stop and lean against a tree until the pain passed. Her water broke during the second hour of walking, soaking through her clothes and making each step uncomfortable and messy. Dehydration was becoming a serious problem. Sarah had underestimated how much water she would need for such a strenuous hike in her condition. The mountain sun was relentless, and she was sweating profusely from both the physical exertion and the stress of labor. Her lips were cracked and dry, and she was starting to feel dizzy and lightheaded. The trail seemed endless, What should have been familiar landmarks looked strange and distorted through her pain and exhaustion. Sarah began to worry that she had taken a wrong turn somewhere, but she couldn't afford to turn back now. She had to keep moving forward, had to reach the road before the baby decided to arrive. As the afternoon stretched on, Sarah's steps became increasingly unsteady. The backpack that had felt manageable that morning now seemed to weigh 100 pounds. Her legs were shaking with fatigue, and the contractions were coming so close together that she barely had time to recover from one before the next one hit. It was during one of these intense contractions that Sarah's legs finally gave out. She had been gripping a boulder for support, trying to breathe through the pain, when suddenly her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the rocky trail, her backpack spilling its contents across the ground. The baby was definitely coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Lying on the hard ground, surrounded by scattered energy bars and medical supplies, Sarah felt a wave of despair wash over her. She was still miles from the main road, with no idea if any vehicles even used that remote highway regularly. The chances of someone finding her in time were slim, and the thought of giving birth alone on a mountain trail filled her with terror. The contractions were now coming every few minutes, each one stronger than the last. Sarah could feel the baby shifting and moving, preparing to make its entrance into the world whether she was ready or not. She tried to remember everything she had learned in her childbirth classes, but those sterile hospital rooms with their comfortable beds and trained medical staff seemed like a distant dream now. As another powerful contraction gripped her body, Sarah let out a cry of pain and frustration that echoed across the empty mountains. The sound seemed to hang in the thin air for a moment before being swallowed by the vast wilderness. In that moment of complete desperation, Sarah realized she might not survive this ordeal. Even if she managed to deliver the baby safely on her own, they could both die of exposure before anyone found them. The sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky, and the mountain air was starting to cool. Sarah knew that temperatures in these mountains could drop dramatically after dark, even in summer. If she and her newborn baby were stuck out here overnight, hypothermia would become a deadly threat. She needed shelter, warmth, and medical attention, none of which were available on this desolate trail. Through her pain and exhaustion, Sarah became aware of a sound in the distance. At first, she thought it might be her imagination or the wind through the trees. But as it grew louder, she realized it was the rhythmic pounding of horse hooves on the rocky trail. Someone was coming, riding hard in her direction. Sarah tried to call out, but her voice was weak and hoarse from dehydration and pain. She managed to raise herself up on her elbows and look down the trail, straining her eyes to see through the late afternoon shadows. The sound of hooves was definitely getting closer, accompanied by the creak of leather and the heavy breathing of a horse that had been running hard. Then, through the trees, she saw him. A lone rider mounted on a powerful bay horse, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had spent countless hours in the saddle. Even from a distance, Sarah could see that this was no casual trail rider. The man sat tall and straight in his saddle, his weathered cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes, and there was something about his bearing that spoke of authority and competence. As the rider drew closer, Sarah could make out more details. He was probably in his 40s, with sun-weathered skin and strong hands that held the reins with casual expertise. His clothes were practical and well-worn, the kind of gear that belonged to someone who worked outdoors for a living. Most importantly, there was a large medical kit strapped to his saddle, along with other emergency supplies that suggested he was prepared for exactly this kind of situation. The horse and rider pulled up short when they spotted Sarah collapsed on the trail. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. He approached Sarah with quick, purposeful strides, his eyes already assessing the situation with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to emergencies. Sarah looked up at her unexpected rescuer, this mysterious horseman who had appeared just when she needed help most desperately. She could see kindness and competence in his weathered face, along with the kind of quiet strength that comes from years of dealing with life and death situations in harsh environments. For the first time since her ordeal began, Sarah felt a flicker of hope that she and her baby might actually survive this day. The stranger knelt beside her, his voice calm and reassuring as he spoke. His words cut through her panic like a lifeline, offering the promise of safety and help in her darkest hour. Sarah realized that her prayers had been answered in the most unexpected way possible. This weathered cowboy, appearing like something out of an old Western movie, might be the miracle she desperately needed. As another contraction hit, Sarah gripped the stranger's strong hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. She didn't know who he was or why he had been riding this remote trail at exactly the right moment, but she knew instinctively that he was someone she could trust with her life and the life of her unborn child. The nightmare of being alone and helpless was finally over, replaced by the comforting presence of someone who clearly knew how to handle a crisis. The mysterious horseman had arrived just in time, but Sarah's ordeal was far from over. The baby was coming whether they were ready or not, and the nearest hospital was still hours away. Whatever happened next, at least she wouldn't have to face it alone anymore. Help had arrived in the most unlikely form imaginable, and Sarah clung to that hope as her labor intensified and the sun continued its descent toward the distant peaks. The stranger knelt beside Sarah with the calm confidence of someone who had faced countless emergencies in the wilderness. His name was Jake Morrison, though Sarah wouldn't learn that until later. To her, he was simply the weathered cowboy who had materialized out of nowhere when she needed help most desperately. Jake's trained eyes quickly assessed the situation. He could see that Sarah was in active labor, dehydrated and exhausted from her ordeal on the mountain trail. Her clothes were soaked with sweat and amniotic fluid, and her face was pale with pain and fatigue. But what impressed him most was the determined look in her eyes. Despite everything she had endured, this woman hadn't given up. "Ma'am, I'm Jake Morrison," he said in a voice that was both gentle and authoritative. "I'm a paramedic with the county search and rescue team, and I'm here to help you." "Can you tell me your name?" Sarah managed to gasp out her name between contractions, relief flooding through her at the word paramedic. This wasn't just some random cowboy who happened to be passing by. This was someone with actual medical training. Someone who knew how to handle emergencies like this. Jake quickly unstrapped his medical kit from his horse and began pulling out supplies. His movements were efficient and practiced, the result of years of training and real-world experience in emergency situations. He had delivered babies before, though usually it was in the back of an ambulance racing toward the hospital, not on a remote mountain trail with darkness approaching. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me carefully," Jake said as he opened a sterile package containing medical gloves. "This baby is coming whether we're ready or not, but we're going to make sure both of you come through this safely. I've delivered dozens of babies, and I promise you're in good hands." As another powerful contraction gripped Sarah's body, Jake timed it carefully on his watch. The contractions were coming every 2 minutes now, lasting nearly a minute each time. There was no way they could get Sarah to a hospital before the baby arrived. They were going to have to deliver this child right here on the mountain trail. Jake's horse, a steady gelding named Thunder, stood patiently nearby as his master worked. The animal was trained for search and rescue operations and was accustomed to staying calm in stressful situations. Jake had been riding the mountain trails for hours, following up on a report of a missing hiker, when he heard Sarah's cry echoing across the peaks. He had immediately turned Thunder toward the sound, pushing the horse hard to reach the source of the distress call. Working quickly, Jake spread a clean tarp on the ground and helped Sarah move onto it. He retrieved a solar-powered radio from his saddlebags and called for backup, though he knew it would be at least an hour before the helicopter could reach them. Assuming the weather held, the afternoon shadows were growing longer and Jake could see storm clouds beginning to build on the western horizon. "Sarah, I need to check how far along you are," Jake explained as he prepared for an examination. His manner was professional and reassuring, helping Sarah feel more comfortable despite the intimate nature of the emergency. "The baby's definitely coming soon, but I need to know exactly how soon." As Jake conducted his assessment, Sarah found herself wondering about this mysterious rescuer who had appeared at exactly the right moment. There was something about his weathered hands and calm demeanor that spoke of someone who had seen plenty of life's hardships but had never let them break his spirit. His voice carried the slight drawl of someone who had grown up in ranch country, and there were laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he was someone who found joy in life despite its challenges. "You're fully dilated," Jake announced after his examination. "This baby is ready to meet the world. I know this isn't exactly the delivery room you had planned, but we're going to make it work." Sarah gripped Jake's hand as another contraction hit, this one stronger than any before. She could feel the baby moving down, preparing to be born. Pain was intense, but it was different from the helpless agony she had experienced while alone. Now it felt purposeful, productive, like her body was finally doing what it was designed to do. Jake coached Sarah through each contraction, his voice steady and encouraging. He had moved to the remote Colorado mountains 5 years earlier, after a divorce that had left him questioning everything about his life in the city. The mountains had become his sanctuary, and his work with the search and rescue team had given him a sense of purpose that had been missing from his previous life as an urban paramedic. Between contractions, Jake shared bits of his story with Sarah, partly to distract her from the pain and partly because he sensed she needed to know she wasn't putting her trust in a complete stranger. He told her about his ranch on the other side of the mountain, where he raised horses and cattle when he wasn't responding to emergency calls. He talked about the satisfaction of living close to the land, of being part of a community where neighbors looked out for each other. "I moved up here after my marriage fell apart," Jake explained as he prepared more medical supplies. "My ex-wife thought I was crazy for wanting to leave the city, but these mountains saved my sanity. Sometimes the best thing you can do is start over somewhere new." Sarah found comfort in Jake's words, recognizing a kindred spirit who had also been forced to rebuild his life from scratch. She told him about her own recent divorce, the betrayal and financial ruin that had led her to accept the job in the remote mountain cabin. As she spoke, Sarah realized that despite the circumstances of their meeting, she felt more understood and accepted by this stranger than she had by her own husband in the final years of their marriage. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, painting the mountain peaks in shades of gold and orange. Jake knew they were running out of daylight, and the temperature would drop significantly once the sun disappeared behind the western mountains. He radioed for an update on the helicopter's arrival time and learned that the aircraft was delayed by mechanical problems. They were on their own for the immediate future. "Sarah, I can see the baby's head," Jake announced with excitement in his voice. "Just a few more pushes and you're going to meet your little one. You're doing amazing." The final stage of labor progressed quickly. With Jake's expert coaching and encouragement, Sarah found reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. The pain was overwhelming, but it was balanced by the incredible anticipation of finally meeting her child. This baby had been her source of hope and motivation through all the dark months following her divorce, and now the moment of birth was finally at hand. As the sun touched the western peaks, Sarah gave one final powerful push. The baby slid into Jake's waiting hands, a perfect little girl who immediately announced her arrival with a strong, healthy cry that echoed across the mountain valley. Jake quickly cleared the infant's airway and wrapped her in a clean blanket he had heated with a chemical heating pad from his medical kit. "Congratulations, Sarah," Jake said with tears in his eyes as he placed the baby on Sarah's chest. "You have a beautiful, healthy daughter." Sarah looked down at her newborn child, overwhelmed with emotions she couldn't even begin to express. The baby was perfect, with a head of dark hair and the most beautiful eyes Sarah had ever seen. After everything she had been through, all the pain and struggle and uncertainty, this moment made it all worthwhile. Jake worked efficiently to complete the delivery, clamping and cutting the umbilical cord with sterile instruments from his medical kit. He checked both mother and baby carefully, monitoring their vital signs and watching for any complications. Both Sarah and her daughter appeared to be healthy and stable, despite the unusual circumstances of the birth. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake built a small fire using dry wood he gathered from the surrounding forest. The temperature was dropping quickly, and he needed to keep Sarah and the baby warm until help arrived. He used his satellite phone to contact the hospital and give them a detailed report on the delivery, ensuring that the medical team would be fully prepared when they finally reached civilization. The baby nursed eagerly, seeming completely unfazed by the fact that she had been born on a mountain trail instead of in a sterile hospital room. Sarah marveled at her daughter's perfect tiny fingers and toes, at the way the infant seemed to look directly at her with such trust and love. For the first time in months, Sarah felt complete and at peace. Jake sat nearby, maintaining the fire and keeping watch over his charges. He had radioed the search and rescue team with an update on their situation and learned that a helicopter would be able to reach them at first light. They would have to spend the night on the mountain, but Jake was confident they could keep mother and baby safe and warm until morning. As the fire crackled and cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, Sarah found herself studying Jake's weathered face in the flickering light. This man had literally saved her life and the life of her daughter. He had appeared at exactly the right moment, like something out of a fairy tale, and had handled the emergency with skill and compassion that went far beyond professional duty. "Why were you on this trail today?" Sarah asked quietly, careful not to wake the sleeping baby in her arms. Jake poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled sky. "I was looking for a missing hiker," he explained, Got a call this morning about someone who was overdue from a backpacking trip. Turned out he made it back to town safely, but nobody thought to call off the search. I was heading back to the main trail when I heard you calling out." Sarah shook her head in amazement. If that hiker had checked in properly, if Jake had taken a different route back to the main trail, if any of a dozen small details had been different, she might have died alone on that mountain path. Instead, a series of coincidences had brought exactly the right person to exactly the right place at exactly the right time. "What's her name?" Jake asked, nodding toward the baby who was sleeping peacefully against Sarah's chest. Sarah looked down at her daughter, considering the question she and Mark had discussed names during the pregnancy. But all those conversations felt like they belonged to a different life now. This baby had been born into a completely different world, delivered by a stranger who had shown more kindness and competence in a few hours than Sarah's husband had shown in years. "Hope," Sarah said suddenly, the name coming to her with absolute certainty. "Her name is Hope Morrison Mitchell." Jake looked surprised. "Morrison?" "After the man who saved our lives," Sarah explained. "I know it's unconventional, but nothing about this situation has been conventional. Hope Morrison Mitchell. It has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, clearly moved by Sarah's gesture. He had delivered other babies during his career, but none of them had been named after him. The honor was both humbling and deeply touching. As the night wore on, Jake and Sarah talked quietly by the fire, sharing stories about their lives and dreams for the future. Despite the unusual circumstances of their meeting, there was an easy comfort between them, as if they had known each other for years rather than hours. Both had been through difficult divorces, both had found healing in the mountains, and both were trying to figure out what came next in their lives. The baby woke periodically to nurse, and each time Sarah marveled anew at the miracle of her daughter's existence. Hope was healthy and strong, completely unaware that her birth story would be unlike any other child's. She had been delivered under the stars by a stranger who had become something much more important in the space of a few hours. As dawn began to break over the eastern peaks, they heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoing across the valleys. Jake stood up and began packing his medical supplies, preparing for the arrival of the medical evacuation team. Soon, Sarah and baby Hope would be in a proper hospital, receiving the care they needed to ensure their continued health. But as Jake helped Sarah prepare for transport, both of them knew that this night on the mountain had changed their lives in ways that went far beyond the dramatic circumstances of Hope's birth. Two lonely souls had found each other in the wilderness, and something beautiful had begun to grow between them, as fragile and precious as the new life they had brought safely into the world together. The helicopter's rotors created a whirlwind of dust and pine needles as it settled onto a small clearing near the trail. The medical evacuation team worked quickly and efficiently, transferring Sarah and baby Hope onto a stretcher and into the aircraft. Jake rode along, his presence a comforting constant as Sarah was whisked away from the mountain wilderness that had become the unexpected birthplace of her daughter. At the regional hospital in Colorado Springs, doctors confirmed what Jake had already determined during his field assessment. Both mother and baby were healthy and stable, with no complications from the unusual delivery circumstances. Sarah's vital signs were good despite her dehydration and exhaustion, and little Hope weighed in at a healthy 6 pounds, 2 ounces. The medical staff was impressed by the quality of care Jake had provided under such challenging conditions. During Sarah's 3-day hospital stay, Jake visited every evening after finishing his shifts with the search and rescue team. He brought flowers from his ranch, children's books he had picked up at the hospital gift shop, and most importantly, his quiet, reassuring presence. Sarah found herself looking forward to his visits, and little Hope seemed to calm down whenever Jake spoke to her in his gentle, gravelly voice. On the day Sarah was discharged from the hospital, she faced a sobering reality. Her company cabin was still without power or communication, her truck was still broken down, and she had nowhere to go with a newborn baby. The divorce settlement had left her with minimal savings, and she couldn't return to her isolated job in the mountains with an infant to care for. Jake appeared in her hospital room that morning with a solution that was both practical and deeply generous. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said, his cowboy hat in his hands as he spoke. "My ranch has plenty of room, and I could use some help with the bookkeeping and administrative side of the operation. It's not glamorous work, but it comes with housing and decent pay. You and Hope would have a safe place to stay while you figure out your next steps." Sarah was overwhelmed by Jake's offer. In less than a week, this man had saved her life, delivered her baby, and now was offering her a chance to rebuild her future. It seemed too good to be true. Yet she could see in his honest eyes that the offer came from genuine concern rather than pity or ulterior motives. "I don't know what to say," Sarah admitted, shifting baby Hope to her shoulder. "You've already done so much for us. I can't ask you to take on even more responsibility." "You're not asking," Jake replied with a slight smile. "I'm offering. And truth is, I really do need the help. Running a ranch is more complicated than it used to be, with government regulations and environmental compliance and all sorts of paperwork I'm not good at. You've got the education and experience for that kind of work, and I've got the space and the steady income to support it." After much consideration and discussion with the hospital social worker, Sarah decided to accept Jake's offer on a temporary basis. She would work as his ranch administrator while living in the guest quarters of his house, with the understanding that the arrangement would continue only as long as it worked well for both of them. Jake's ranch was everything Sarah had hoped it would be, and more. Nestled in a valley between two mountain ridges, the property encompassed several hundred acres of pasture and forest. The main house was a sprawling log structure that Jake had built himself over several years, with large windows that offered stunning views of the surrounding peaks. The guest quarters where Sarah and Hope would live consisted of a comfortable bedroom, private bathroom, small kitchen, and sitting area that Jake had originally built for visiting relatives. The work was exactly what Sarah needed to rebuild her confidence and sense of purpose. Jake's ranch operation was more complex than she had expected, involving not just cattle and horses but also guided hunting trips, horseback riding lessons for tourists, and a small organic vegetable operation that supplied several local restaurants. Sarah threw herself into organizing his chaotic records, setting up proper accounting systems, and handling the growing amount of regulatory compliance required for his various business activities. Baby Hope thrived in the mountain environment. Jake had converted one corner of the ranch office into a nursery area where Sarah could work while keeping an eye on her daughter. The clean mountain air and peaceful surroundings seemed to agree with the infant, who slept better and cried less than many newborns. When Sarah was particularly busy with administrative tasks, Jake would often take Hope on short walks around the ranch property, talking to her about the horses and cattle as if she could understand every word. As weeks turned into months, Sarah found herself settling into ranch life more completely than she had expected. She learned to ride horses under Jake's patient instruction, helped with the easier ranch chores, and discovered a love for the outdoor lifestyle she had never known she possessed. The mountains that had once seemed threatening and hostile during her desperate walk down the trail now felt like a protective embrace around her new life. Jake proved to be everything Sarah had sensed during that first night on the mountain trail. He was kind without being condescending, strong without being domineering, and reliable in a way that was completely foreign to Sarah after her marriage to Mark. He never made assumptions about what Sarah could or couldn't handle, always asked before making decisions that affected her and Hope, and treated both of them with a respect and consideration that gradually healed the wounds left by her divorce. The growing attraction between Sarah and Jake was undeniable, but both were cautious about rushing into anything that might complicate their working relationship or Sarah's recovery from her previous marriage. They spent long evenings talking on the ranch house porch, sharing their thoughts about life, their hopes for the future, and their growing feelings for each other, but they were careful to maintain appropriate boundaries, understanding that Sarah needed time and space to fully heal from her past before she could commit to a new relationship. Hope's first birthday celebration was a milestone that marked how far they had all come. The party was small, just Sarah, Jake, and a few neighbors from nearby ranches, but it was filled with warmth and joy. Hope took her first steps that day, tottering across the living room from Sarah's arms to Jake's, as if she understood instinctively that these were the two most important people in her small world. As Hope grew from infant to toddler, she developed a special bond with Jake that delighted and sometimes amazed Sarah. The little girl would light up whenever Jake appeared, reaching for him with chubby arms and babbling excitedly in her own special language. Jake, for his part, seemed to have a natural instinct for fatherhood that he had never had the chance to explore during his previous marriage. He was patient with Hope's tantrums, creative in his approaches to entertaining her, and protective in a way that was both gentle and fierce. One evening, as Sarah was putting Hope to bed in their little apartment, the toddler surprised her by pointing to a photograph of Jake and clearly saying, "Dada." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, realizing that her daughter had chosen her own father figure, regardless of biology or legal relationships. When she told Jake about the incident, tears welled up in his eyes as he realized how completely this little family had changed his life. It was around Hope's second birthday that Sarah finally felt ready to explore the romantic feelings that had been growing between her and Jake for months. They had been working together successfully for nearly 2 years, had developed a deep friendship and mutual respect, and had proven that they could handle the challenges of raising Hope together. When Jake finally kissed her one evening as they watched the sunset from the ranch house porch, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Their courtship was gentle and unhurried, both of them aware that they were building something that needed to be strong and lasting. They took weekend trips with Hope to explore other parts of Colorado, went on proper dates when neighbors could babysit, and slowly merged their separate living spaces into a shared family home. Sarah moved her belongings from the guest quarters into Jake's bedroom, and Hope got a beautiful new room that Jake decorated with hand-painted murals of horses and mountains. The wedding took place 3 years after that dramatic night when Hope was born on the mountain trail. It was a small ceremony held on the ranch with the same view of the peaks where their story had begun. Hope, now a confident 3-year-old, served as flower girl, scattering rose petals with serious concentration as she walked down the makeshift aisle. During their vows, Sarah and Jake both acknowledged the unusual circumstances that had brought them together and their gratitude for the second chances they had found in each other. Jake formally adopted Hope shortly after the wedding, giving her the Morrison name she'd carried informally since birth. The legal proceedings were simple since Mark had voluntarily relinquished his parental rights years earlier, wanting no connection to the child whose existence reminded him of his failures and mistakes. Hope was too young to understand the legal significance of the adoption, but she was old enough to understand that Jake was now officially her daddy in every way that mattered. As Hope grew older, she loved hearing the story of her dramatic birth on the mountain trail. Sarah and Jake never embellished the tale or made it seem more romantic than it actually was, but they also never downplayed the miraculous timing that had brought Jake to exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Hope was proud of her unusual birth story and enjoyed telling her friends about being delivered under the stars by a cowboy on horseback. The ranch continued to prosper under Sarah's administrative guidance and Jake's operational expertise. They expanded the guest facilities to accommodate visitors who wanted to experience authentic ranch life, added educational programs about sustainable agriculture and wildlife conservation, and developed a reputation for excellence that brought customers from across the country. Sarah's business background, combined with Jake's practical knowledge and their shared commitment to environmental stewardship, proved to be a winning combination. When Hope started school, she was confident and well-adjusted, equally comfortable in the mountains and in town. She had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's practical skills, along with a deep love for the natural world that surrounded their ranch. Teachers noted that Hope was mature for her age, probably due to growing up around adults who treated her as an important member of the family rather than just a child to be managed. 5 years after their marriage, Sarah and Jake welcomed a son they named David. Hope was thrilled to become a big sister and took her new responsibilities seriously, helping with feeding and diaper changes and entertaining David with elaborate stories about ranch life. The family was complete now, bound together not just by love and legal documents but by shared experiences and mutual respect. As Sarah approached her 40th birthday, she often reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that terrifying day when she collapsed on the mountain trail. The woman who had been abandoned and betrayed by her first husband had found a love deeper and more satisfying than she had ever imagined possible. The desperate pregnancy that had nearly ended in tragedy had given her not just a daughter, but an entire new family and way of life. Jake, now in his 50s, had found the family he had always wanted, but never believed he could have. His quiet strength and natural wisdom made him an ideal father to both Hope and David, and his partnership with Sarah in both business and marriage was everything he had dreamed of during his lonely years after his first divorce. The ranch continued to be their sanctuary and their livelihood, a place where they could raise their children with strong values and deep connections to the natural world. Hope and David grew up understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves, whether it was the ecosystem of the mountains or the community of neighbors who looked out for each other. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch work was done for the day, Sarah and Jake would sometimes walk out to the spot where Hope had been born. The trail had been improved over the years, with better markers and emergency communication equipment installed by the county, but the essential wildness of the place remained unchanged. Standing there together under the same stars that had witnessed Hope's dramatic entrance into the world, Sarah and Jake would remember that desperate night when two strangers had found each other in the darkness. They had both been broken in different ways, both seeking healing and redemption in the mountains. What they found instead was something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed: a love strong enough to overcome any obstacle, and a family built on foundations deeper than blood or law. Their story had begun with a crisis that could have ended in tragedy. Instead, it had become the foundation for a life filled with purpose, joy, and the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful together. The woman who had collapsed alone and pregnant on a mountain trail had become the heart of a thriving family and successful business. The solitary cowboy who had spent years avoiding emotional commitments had discovered that true strength comes not from independence, but from the willingness to love and be loved completely. Hope Morrison Mitchell, now a confident young girl with her father's steady demeanor and her mother's quick intelligence, would grow up knowing that she had been born into a love story that proved miracles could happen even in the darkest moments. Her dramatic birth had been just the beginning of a tale that would continue to unfold for decades to come, written in the daily acts of love, kindness, and commitment that bound her unique family together. The mountains that had witnessed their first meeting continued to stand guard over their happiness, eternal and unchanging, a reminder that some things in life are solid enough to build dreams upon and strong enough to last forever.